They stood in the snow, watching him stack rough posts and planks around the outside of his cabin, shaking their heads. To them, it looked like wasted effort, an awkward second skin, a porch that didn't lead anywhere, a place where winter already punished every mistake. Adding more structure seemed like inviting trouble. The wind was already cutting through the valley. It always did. Long, steady gusts that found every crack, every seam, every careless decision. Most cabins up here didn't fail because the stove went cold. They failed because the wind never let the heat stay. No one expected that odd outer shell to matter. No one expected it to change anything at all. And no one expected that, by midwinter, that same cabin would be holding nearly 30 degrees more heat than the others around it. The question wasn't whether it looked strange. The question was why it worked. The cabin sat in a high, exposed stretch of North American backcountry. The kind of place where winter didn't arrive gently. Snow came early. Wind never stopped. Temperatures dropped fast and stayed low for weeks at a time. This was hunting country, trapping country, the sort of place settled by people who learned quickly or didn't last long. The man who built the cabin wasn't experimenting. He was adapting. He'd seen winters claim good shelters before. He knew the pattern. When the cold deepened, most people focused on the stove. Bigger fires, more wood, longer nights feeding flames. But the cold didn't come from a lack of fire. It came from everything else stealing that heat away. Up here, cabins froze, even with smoke pouring from the chimney. Floors stayed icy. Walls radiated cold. When the wind came, it felt like the structure itself was breathing the warmth out, replacing it with cold air inch by inch. That was the failure point. Not fire, not effort, exposure. So when he started building the shell, neighbors assumed he'd misjudged the problem. They thought he was building a porch for comfort, maybe storage, maybe future expansion. Some said it would trap snow. Others said it would rot. Few said it would just give the wind more surfaces to tear apart. But the shell wasn't for living, and it wasn't for looks. It was for the wind. The idea itself wasn't new, even if it looked that way. Long before insulation rolls and plastic barriers, people learned that still air was one of the best insulators available. Wind was the enemy because it stripped heat faster than cold ever could. Stop the wind, and suddenly the same fire did more work. The porch shell wrapped the cabin on all sides, leaving a narrow space between the outer structure and the original walls. No gaps big enough for wind to rush through, no direct exposure. Just a buffer zone where air slowed down and settled. At first glance, it seemed like nothing had changed. The cabin was the same size. The stove was the same. The woodpile didn't shrink. But as the season turned, small differences began to show. On calm days, the cabin already felt steadier, less fluctuation, less of that sharp chill near the walls. Then the storms came. When winter settled in fully, the wind became constant. Gusts howled across open ground, slamming into cabins that stood naked against it. You could feel it inside those homes. Cold crept along floors. Drafts formed behind furniture. Heat rose and vanished. Inside the porch-shelled cabin, something different happened. The wind still roared outside, but it no longer reached the walls. Instead, it hit the outer shell, lost speed, and broke apart. By the time any air reached the original cabin walls, it was slow, cold, and calm. That space between structures became a quiet zone. A dead air pocket. Not warm, but stable. Instability was everything. While nearby cabins burned wood faster and faster, this one held steady. Fires lasted longer. The air inside stopped shifting so violently. Floors stayed noticeably warmer. Even the smell of smoke changed, less frantic, less sharp. As nights grew colder, the contrast sharpened. Other cabins needed constant attention. Stoves demanded feeding through the night. Miss a few hours, and the temperature plunged. In the porch-shelled cabin, the drop was slower, more forgiving. Heat lingered. By the coldest stretch of winter, when temperatures outside stayed brutal day and night, the difference could finally be measured clearly. The interior of the porch-shelled cabin consistently held around 28 degrees more heat than comparable cabins nearby, using the same fuel and the same stove size. That was the moment the laughter stopped. Nothing magical had happened. No secret materials. no clever tricks hidden in the walls. The fire was the same fire everyone else used. Difference was what the heat wasn't fighting anymore. Wind doesn't just cool surfaces. It steals heat by forcing constant air exchange. Every crack becomes a vacuum. Every seam becomes a leak. When wind presses against a structure, it drives cold air in and pulls warm air out, even if the gaps are small. By blocking the wind before it ever touched the cabin, the shell removed that pressure. Air inside stopped being replaced so aggressively. Heat stopped escaping so quickly. The cabin didn't need to be sealed perfectly because it wasn't being attacked constantly. The outer shell also changed how moisture behaved. Snow piled against it instead of the cabin walls. Ice formed farther out. The original structure stayed drier, and dry materials hold heat far better than damp ones. Even the ground around the cabin benefited. Drifts formed differently. Cold air pooled farther away. The cabin sat inside a calmer microclimate created by its own shape. This was the part most people missed. The shell wasn't insulation in the modern sense, it was protection. A way of controlling the environment immediately around the cabin instead of fighting the entire winter at once. Frontier builders understood this instinctively. Barns around houses, windbreaks around livestock, double walls in extreme regions. The goal was never to overpower nature, it was to redirect it. Once you slow the wind, heat behaves differently. Warm air lingers, surfaces stop radiating cold as aggressively. The stove's output becomes predictable instead of constantly overwhelmed. That's why the temperature difference wasn't 5 degrees, or 10. It was enough to change how the cabin was lived in, enough to reduce wood use, enough to sleep through the night without feeding the fire. The porch shell didn't make the cabin warm on its own, it simply stopped wasting what was already there. By the end of winter, the structure that once drew laughter looked less foolish. Snow had piled high against the outer walls, acting as yet another barrier. Inside, the cabin remained dry, calm, and steady. The stove worked less. The work of survival felt lighter. The lesson wasn't about copying the exact shape or layout. It was about understanding the real enemy. In cold climates, wind is often more dangerous than low temperature itself. It accelerates heat loss, drives moisture where it doesn't belong, and turns small flaws into constant failures. Old builders didn't always have better tools, but they paid closer attention to how air moved, how snow drifted, and how heat escaped. They built for the environment they were in, not the one they wished they had. The porch shell was just one expression of that thinking, a reminder that sometimes the smartest solution isn't adding more fire, more fuel, or more effort, but removing the forces that steal warmth in the first place.